2 years ago, me and my husband lived in Provo, Utah. While we were there, my husband was at home teaching to a family who was expecting their first child. They were very excited. She was only 26 weeks along, but she was really eagerly anticipating the birth of their first little boy. Well, one day in late August, she was sitting in her chair in the balcony, and she got this really intense pain, and she thought, this isn't right. So she called her husband, and they rushed her to the hospital. When they got there, the doctor walked in and checked her over and said, you know what, you're fine. Just go home. And she was like, okay, I guess I'm fine. He knows what he's talking about, right? She gets home, and she walks through the door. She gets this intense pain that almost collapses her. Her husband rushes her back to the hospital, and she unfortunately delivers her little son on a gurney on the way in. They didn't think he was going to live. He was only 26 weeks gestational. They flew him to Primary Children's, and they put him in a little incubator. She wasn't allowed to touch him for the first month, and then after that, she was allowed to reach her hand in through the hole and touch him for an hour a day. And the rest of the time, she had to stand outside of the glass looking at her son for 6 months. The stake president came to visit her and said, what can we do as a stake to help produce a miracle for this little boy? And she looked at him square in the eye and she said, tell everyone that they need to do 100% of their home and visiting teaching. Now, what does home and visiting teaching have to do with producing a miracle, right? Miracles should not be regarded as deviations from the ordinary course of nature, so much as manifestations of divine spiritual power. Miracles aren't out of the ordinary. They're very much in manifestations of divine spiritual power. They're very much of the ordinary, of a higher power than ourselves. Have miracles ceased? Moroni 7:37 says, for it is by faith that miracles are wrought. If these things have ceased, woe unto the state of man. For it is because of unbelief, and all is vain. Faith is an action of a belief that is true. If we stop, then all is vain. All miracles cease, because as we learned, miracles are a production of a higher spiritual power. But unless we aren't acting, then they will not happen. We all know the story of the sons of Helaman, how they were able to take arms so that their fathers would not have to take arms, so they could protect their families. Well, the very first battle that they were fighting, their whole objective was to lure the Lamanites out of their stronghold and to take them out into the wilderness. Well, as they were doing that, a whole bunch of Nephites were supposed to come up from behind and attack the Lamanites, and the Nephites were supposed to, the sons of Helaman were supposed to take a break. Well, the Nephite army did not catch up to the Lamanite army for 3 days. So the sons of Helaman were like totally exhausted. And same with this Lamanite army. Well, finally, the Nephite army catches up with the Lamanite army, and they have this huge battle. And the sons of Helaman stop, and Helaman turns to his sons and says, what do you want to do? They had a moment to act. And they turned to him and said, we will fight. We will do this, and God will protect us. And they did. And they came up, and they were able to fight off the Lamanites. And at the end, they realized that not one was lost. How did that happen? How did not any one of them get killed? However, there were an extreme amount of people that got killed on both the Lamanites and the Nephite side. And the answer is back in the decision when they decided to act. They didn't act on their own courage or their own pride of what they knew was to be true. They acted on faith and humility. Humility is not fear or self-doubt. Humility is a power from a divine source that comes from within. And as they acted, they were able to produce a miracle. Not one was lost. When we were living in Provo, I had 3 sisters I was visiting teaching. Well, one winter day, I had this huge impression that I needed to take cookies to the sister. I shoved it aside. I had too much to do. I had a 6-month-old son. I wasn't taking him out into the snow. There was no way. Well, the impression came again. And so I took it. I'm like, you know what? This is meant to be. So I baked cookies, and I loaded my 6-month-old son in the car, and we went over to the sister's house. I got out of the car and went to her doorstep and rang the door. No one was there. So what was the use? Why was I supposed to take cookies to the sister when nobody was there? So I put the cookies down, and I turned around, and across the street, there was an old lady in a dress, in crutches, who was trying to shovel her sidewalk. I knew in that moment why I had that impression. And so I was able to go over and take the shovel and help shovel the rest of her sidewalk. And for that moment of that sister's life, I was able to ease her suffering. And that is a miracle. I learned 2 things that day. I learned, number 1, that when impressions come, to look at every single option you have that's around you. It may not come in the direct source you're thinking. But number 2, that as I act on the power within, on that impression, on the humility, on the faith, then I was able to produce a miracle. Now, can you imagine if there were many people who were able to produce that miracle? Unity is everything. In a study done by 12,376 students in a university, they found that those students who volunteered in college were 100% more likely to help others in difficulty after college, participate in community action programs after college, and develop a meaningful philosophy of life throughout their life. They set in place a pattern that produced miracles. So think back to when I helped this lady shovel the walk and I was able to produce just a tiny bit of a miracle. Well, think about how if everybody was working together, acting on those humility promptings, on those humble promptings, what kind of miracles could be produced? Back to this lady who had her little baby in the hospital. Our ward did 100% of their home and visiting teaching. There were people who were going over to take their garbage out. There were people who were going over and mowing their lawn. And there were people who were sending them food and money. And it was incredible because after 6 months, the little boy was doing beautiful. There was no problems whatsoever. The doctors have called him the miracle baby.